Hi, I'm Daniel Lucas,
And this is Mick, the Doctor of Digital.
and welcome to Love Letters. Love Letters are a collection of love stories. So people got lost, got crazy in the name of love. And today, another great episode. Dating in a New Rome, ancient wisdom for a swipe right world.
The parallels are unmistakable. Just as late imperial Rome witnessed the dissolution of marriage bonds, the commodification of sexuality, and a culture of endless pleasure, seeking that ultimately led to profound spiritual emptiness, our contemporary swipe right world mirrors these same patterns of relational decay. The Roman elites pursued sexual novelty while their marriages crumbled. Young people retreated into hedonistic escapism, and society fractured along lines of mutual incomprehension between the sexes. Today's hookup culture, dating apps, and the retreat of both men and women from committed relationships represents not progress but regression, a return to the very patterns of relational chaos that the early Christian movement emerged to heal. What the early church often then, it offers now a revolutionary vision of human connection that transcends both libertine excess and cynical withdrawal, providing instead a pathway to authentic intimacy that every human heart truly seeks.
Truly seeks for sure. Mr. Mac, was there a decline of morality in Republican Rome?
The parallels between late Republican Rome and our contemporary moment become even more striking when we hear the voices of Romans themselves lamenting their cultural moral decay. Cicero's famous cry, O tempora, O mores, O the times, O the customs, echoed through the forum as he witnessed traditional Roman virtues crumbling under the weight of luxury and political corruption. He observed that morals today are corrupted by our worship of riches, identifying the same materialistic obsession that characterizes our swipe right culture. Tacitus provided perhaps the most penetrating diagnosis of Republican decline, noting that the more corrupt the state, the more numerous the laws. His insight that formerly we suffered from crimes, now we suffer from laws, reveals how legal proliferation often masks rather than cures underlying moral decay. Today, we voluntarily give up our agency to whom? We have endless dating apps and relationship advice industries proliferate precisely because we've lost the fundamental wisdom about human connection that earlier generations took for granted. Juvenal's satirical verses systematically documented the transformation from a republic built on civic virtue, personal honor, and moral restraint into an empire obsessed with entertainment and instant gratification, the ancient equivalent of our contemporary bread and circuses culture of endless streaming, social media, and hookup apps that distract from deeper human need for authentic community and committed love. In conclusion, Roman writers saw the problem but had no solution until the rise of Christianity.
Mr. Mac, are we really living through a similar cultural moment? And what can we learn from how early Christians responded to their own sexually permissive culture?
The early Christians weren't writing into a vacuum. They were addressing a culture remarkably similar to ours. When Paul wrote his letters to Corinth around 55 AD, he was writing to a port city famous for its sexual permissiveness, where temple prostitution was normalized and casual sexual relationships were considered sophisticated urban living. The phrase to Corinthianize literally meant to engage in sexual immorality. Sound familiar? The parallels go deeper than mere sexual behavior. Roman culture in the first and second centuries had developed what we might recognize as dating app mentality. The wealthy used slaves and prostitutes as interchangeable sexual partners. Marriage became increasingly transactional and temporary. And philosophers like Ovid actually wrote guides on sexual conquest that read like ancient versions of pickup artist manuals. Similar to our own time, birth rates plummeted. The Emperor Augustus had to pass legislation trying to incentivize marriage because Roman citizens were increasingly avoiding permanent commitment. What's fascinating is how the early Christian writer of the Didache, written around 70 AD, diagnosed the spiritual emptiness underlying this sexual chaos. The text warns against what it calls the way of death, not just individual sins, but entire cultural patterns that appear to offer freedom while actually enslaving people to insatiable appetites. They understood that sexual permissiveness wasn't the cause of cultural decay, but a symptom of deeper spiritual homelessness. Ignatius of Antioch, writing around 110 AD, described Roman sexual culture as creating what he called false communion, people desperately seeking connection through physical intimacy, but finding only deeper isolation because they were approaching sexuality as consumption rather than covenant. He observed that when people treat each other as sources of pleasure rather than bearers of divine image, even physical intimacy becomes a form of loneliness. The early Christians recognized that late Roman culture's sexual permissiveness was actually a form of despair disguised as sophistication. When Augustus's own daughter, Julia, was exiled for adultery, it revealed the hollowness beneath the imperial family's public celebration of sexual liberation. The very people who had everything Roman culture could offer, wealth, power, unlimited sexual access, were among the most miserable and self destructive. This is precisely what we see today. The sexual revolution promised liberation, but delivered the highest rates of depression, anxiety, and relationship dysfunction in recorded history. Dating apps promised connection, but created a culture of endless comparison and disposability. Hookup culture promised freedom from traditional constraints, but trapped people in cycles of emotional numbness and spiritual emptiness. In conclusion, what the early Christians understood and what we need to recover today is that authentic freedom comes not from eliminating boundaries around sexuality, but from ordering our desires toward relationships that can actually sustain human flourishing. Relationships characterized by permanent commitment, mutual knowledge, and the kind of vulnerable love that transforms rather than merely satisfies.
How do we present the Christian vision of committed relationships as genuinely attractive rather than restrictive to people who've been told that commitment equals limitation and that keeping your options open leads to a better outcomes, Mr. Max?
This goes to the heart of what Augustine called rightly ordered love in his Confessions. Augustine lived through exactly this dilemma. He spent years convinced that sexual freedom would lead to fulfillment, moving from relationship to relationship, avoiding commitment because he believed it would limit his possibilities for happiness. What he discovered was that this approach actually limited his capacity for the deep joy he was seeking. Augustine's breakthrough is directly related to romantic relationships. Our hearts are designed for the security and depth that come only through permanent commitment. When we try to maintain multiple options, we're actually choosing anxiety over peace, surface connection over intimate knowledge. Modern psychology validates this ancient wisdom in remarkable ways. Dr. Barry Schwartz's research on the paradox of choice demonstrates that people with too many options experience higher levels of anxiety, lower satisfaction with their decisions, and chronic instability that prevents them from fully investing in any single choice. This is exactly what Augustine experienced in his serial sexual relationships. The very freedom he thought would make him happier actually made contentment impossible. The early Christians understood that covenant love creates what Basil the Great called sacred space, a relational environment where both partners can risk complete vulnerability because they know they're safe from abandonment. When someone knows their partner has chosen them permanently, it eliminates the performance anxiety that characterizes modern dating. You don't have to constantly prove your worth or worry that any conflict might end the relationship. Think about how different this is from dating app culture, where people are constantly wondering if their partner might find someone better with the next swipe. That underlying insecurity makes authentic intimacy impossible because both people remain emotionally guarded, unable to show their full selves for fear of being replaced. John Chrysostom, writing in the 4th century, described marriage as creating one soul in two bodies, not the loss of individual identity, but the creation of a new form of existence where each person's flourishing becomes inseparable from their partner's well being. This isn't a limitation, but an expansion. Instead of being trapped in the narrow concerns of autonomous individualism, married couples have access to shared dreams, mutual support, and the profound satisfaction that comes from building something beautiful together. Scripture captures this beautifully. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This isn't describing restriction, but transformation, the creation of something new and more wonderful than either person could achieve alone. Commitment doesn't limit love, but liberates it from the anxiety, superficiality, and chronic dissatisfaction that characterize relationships built on keeping options open. In conclusion, the early Christians offered then and offer now the radical vision that choosing one person forever actually opens up infinite possibilities for mutual discovery, growth, and joy.
Mr. Mick, I keep hearing that modern psychology conflicts with traditional Christian sexual ethics, but you seem to suggest they actually support each other. How do we make sense of these apparent contradiction?
This is where we need to distinguish between ideologically driven psychology that assumes Christian ethics are repressive and actual research on what creates human flourishing in relationships. When you look at peer reviewed studies on relationship satisfaction, attachment formation, and sexual fulfillment, they consistently validate the patterns that early Christian writers described centuries ago. Consider the work of Dr. Helen Fisher on brain chemistry and bonding. Her neuroimaging studies show that sexual intimacy triggers large releases of those neurochemicals that promote emotional bonding, whether people intend it or not. Casual sexual encounters flood the brain with these bonding chemicals, but without relational stability to sustain the bonds, people can experience what Fisher calls attachment disruption, a form of neurological whiplash that makes future bonding more difficult. This is precisely what Augustine described in his Confessions when he wrote about the wound that casual relationships created in his capacity for authentic intimacy. He wasn't making moral pronouncements, but psychological observations. He noticed that each uncommitted sexual relationship made it harder for him to trust, bond, and find satisfaction in subsequent relationships. Dr. Mark Regeneris's longitudinal research on sexual behavior and relationship outcomes provides even more striking validation of early Christian insights. His studies show that people who follow what researchers call traditional sexual scripts, physical intimacy within committed exclusive relationships, report significantly higher levels of sexual satisfaction, relationship stability, and overall life satisfaction than those who follow contemporary dating patterns. The early church fathers understood what neuroscience now confirms. Human beings are literally designed for pair bonding. The DDK's teachings on sexual morality weren't arbitrary rules, but wisdom about how to protect and cultivate our natural capacity for deep attachment. When Clement of Alexandria wrote about marriage as a sacred union, he was describing the psychological and spiritual conditions that allow human bonding mechanisms to function optimally. What's particularly fascinating is research on sexual satisfaction. The National Health and Social Life Survey, the most comprehensive study of sexual behavior and satisfaction in America, found that the people reporting the highest levels of sexual satisfaction were married couples in committed relationships, not single people with multiple partners. Married women were twice as likely to report being extremely satisfied sexually compared to single women. Dr. Scott Stanley's research on commitment and relationship satisfaction provides the psychological framework for understanding why this happens. He distinguishes between constraint commitment, staying together because leaving is difficult, and dedication commitment, staying together because you've chosen this person as your life partner. Couples with high dedication and commitment report dramatically higher relationship and sexual satisfaction because both partners can invest fully without fear of abandonment. The Song of Solomon captures this psychological reality perfectly. I am my beloved's, and my beloved is mine. This isn't possessiveness, but the security that allows complete emotional and physical vulnerability. When both partners know they belong permanently to each other, it creates space for the kind of intimate exploration and mutual discovery that generates lasting sexual and emotional satisfaction. Rigorous psychological research consistently validates the relational wisdom that early Christians articulated, that human beings flourish in relationships characterized by exclusive commitment, emotional intimacy, and the security that comes from permanent mutual choice. In conclusion, the conflict isn't between psychology and Christian ethics, but between ideological assumptions about sexuality and the actual scientific evidence about what creates human flourishing.
Mr. Mick, we're seeing young men either retreat in toxic masculinity movements or completely withdraw from dating through pornography and video games. How would the early Christians writers have understood this crisis of masculine identity, and what alternative would they offer?
The early church fathers would have recognized this immediately as what they called false masculinity, men proving to prove their worth through dominance, conquest, or withdrawal rather than finding their identity in their capacity for sacrificial love and faithful commitment. Both toxic masculinity and the MGTOW, men going their own way response, represent what Augustine would have called disordered loves, attempts to find masculine identity in places that can't actually provide it. John Chrysostom's writings on masculine virtue offer a radical alternative to both extremes. He described authentic masculinity as the strength to be gentle, not weakness disguised as kindness, but power so secure it can afford tenderness. Chrysostom observed that men who need to dominate women or withdraw from them entirely are actually revealing their own weakness, not strength. True masculine power finds its expression in the ability to create security for others, to remain emotionally present despite risk, and to choose commitment over self protection. The crisis you're describing actually stems from what the Desert Fathers would have recognized as spiritual homelessness. When men don't know their fundamental identity and worth, they seek validation through external conquests, sexual conquests, professional achievements, or the conquest of other men through competition. But these external validations are inherently unstable, creating what Evagrius Ponticus called the tyranny of restless desire, a compulsive need for more conquest because no amount is ever enough to provide lasting security. Pornography represents a particularly devastating form of false masculinity because it offers the illusion of sexual conquest without any of the vulnerability, commitment, or genuine courage that authentic masculine sexuality requires. Dr. Gary Wilson's research on pornography and brain chemistry shows that regular use literally rewires the brain's reward pathways, making users less capable of the kind of patient, attentive, generous sexuality that characterizes mature masculine love. The ancient tradition offers something revolutionary, the vision of masculine strength expressed through faithful commitment rather than conquest or withdrawal. When Paul writes, "Husband, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her," he's describing masculine power as fundamentally self sacrificial and protective rather than self serving. This directly addresses the modern masculine crisis because it provides men with a vision of strength that actually sustainable and fulfilling. Toxic masculinity requires men to maintain a performance of dominance that's exhausting and ultimately hollow. MGTOW represents surrender disguised as self protection. But the Christian vision offers men the opportunity to find their strength in their capacity for committed love, something that becomes more fulfilling and more secure over time rather than less. Think about how this applies to dating and relationships. Instead of approaching women as conquest to validate masculine worth or avoiding them as threats to masculine autonomy, the early Christian vision invites men to see relationship as the arena where authentic masculine virtue is both developed and expressed. The man who can remain emotionally present through conflict, who can choose his partner's well being even when it costs him something, who can create the security that allows another person to flourish, this man embodies the kind of strength that both men and women find deeply attractive. The pop psychology movement around figures like Jordan Peterson, despite its limitations, has resonated with young men precisely because it offers them a vision of masculine responsibility and competence. But the early Christian tradition goes deeper. It grounds masculine identity not in personal competence alone, but in the call to serve something greater than oneself. The ancient church offers men something that neither toxic masculinity nor withdrawal provides, a vision of masculine strength that finds its power not in dominance or autonomy, but in the capacity for faithful, sacrificial love that creates flourishing for others. In conclusion, this approach to masculinity becomes more satisfying and more secure over time, rather than requiring constant validation through conquest or self protection through withdrawal.
Mr. Meg, this all sounds compelling in theory, but how do we actually apply this insight to modern dating? What would it took like a practical to date with this ancient wisdom in mind while still living in a culture organized around completely different principles?
The early Christian communities were masters of countercultural living, and their approach to courtship provides a practical roadmap for navigating modern dating with ancient wisdom. The key insight from texts like The Shepherd of Hermas is that relationships should be fundamentally formational rather than recreational. Every interaction should help both people become better versions of themselves and discern whether they're called to build a life together. Practically, this means completely reframing the questions you ask during dating. Instead of, are we having fun or are we physically attracted? The primary questions become, is this relationship helping me grow in virtue? And are we developing the kind of friendship and mutual respect that could sustain a marriage? This doesn't eliminate enjoyment, it elevates it by grounding temporary pleasure in permanent purpose. Start with what Christians call fellowship, getting to know potential partners in group settings where you can observe their character in natural, unstressed environments. Pay attention to how they treat service workers, how they handle disagreement, and how they respond to inconvenience. Ignatius of Antioch wrote that authentic character is revealed not in ideal circumstances, but in how people respond when things don't go as planned. The early church practiced what we might call graduated intimacy, physical, emotional, and spiritual closeness that developed in proper sequence rather than rushing immediately to maximum vulnerability. This isn't about rigid rules, but about creating the conditions where genuine compatibility can be discerned. When physical intimacy precedes emotional and spiritual intimacy, it often creates false bonding that prevents couples from seeing clearly whether they're actually compatible for marriage. Set boundaries that preserve space for conversation, shared activities, and mutual observation of character. Dr. Scott Stanley's research shows that couples who prioritize friendship and compatibility before physical intimacy have significantly lower divorce rates and higher relationship satisfaction. The ancient wisdom of gradual courtship turns out to be psychologically optimal for long term relationship success. Most importantly, approach dating with what Augustine called rightly ordered intention, the clear understanding that you're looking for a spouse, not just enjoying romantic experiences. This means being honest about your ultimate goals, developing the communication and conflict resolution skills you'll need in marriage, and cultivating the spiritual and emotional maturity that permanent commitment requires. This approach actually makes dating more exciting, not less, because every conversation becomes meaningful, every shared experience significant. You're not just passing time, you're exploring the possibility of shared destiny. The stakes are higher, which makes everything more vivid and important. Here's the paradox that early Christians understood: choosing limitation actually creates freedom. When you eliminate the anxiety of wondering whether each relationship might be the one, you can invest more fully in getting to know each person. When you remove the pressure of physical performance from early dating, conversations become deeper and more revealing. Scripture provides the perfect framework. Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. Proverbs 4:23. Dating with ancient wisdom means protecting your emotional and physical vulnerability until you found someone worthy of receiving it completely. Someone who shares your values, complements your character, and demonstrates the maturity necessary for lifelong partnerships. The practical result is relationships characterized by security rather than anxiety, depth rather than performance, and mutual growth rather than mutual entertainment. These relationships prepare both people for the kind of marriage that becomes more satisfying over time rather than gradually disappointing. Applying ancient wisdom to modern dating means treating courtship as preparation for marriage rather than entertainment, prioritizing character over chemistry, maintaining physical boundaries that preserve emotional clarity, and approaching each relationship as an opportunity to practice the virtues that make lasting love possible. In conclusion, there are practical guidelines for love, not legalistic rules.
Indeed, and not legalistic rules. What gives you hope that young people today can actually embrace this ancient wisdom? And what encouragement would you offer to someone who wants to live this way, but it feels completely alone in it?
My deepest source of hope comes from recognizing that we're describing something that works with human nature rather than against it. The early Christians weren't imposing arbitrary restrictions on reluctant human desires. They were discovering the conditions under which human beings naturally flourish in relationships. When people experience authentic intimacy based on commitment, vulnerability, and mutual self gift, they never want to return to shallow alternatives. I see this happening already among young adults who are quietly rejecting hookup culture, not because of religious pressure, but because it's making them miserable. The documented sexual recession among Gen Z isn't just about anxiety and technology. It's about intelligent young people recognizing that contemporary dating culture isn't delivering on its promises. They're hungry for the depth, meaning, and genuine connection that the ancient tradition provides. What's particularly encouraging is how this wisdom appeals across ideological lines. I've seen secular students embrace concepts like dating intentionally and emotional boundaries because these approaches actually work better than the alternatives. When you show people that Christian sexual ethics produce higher rates of relationship satisfaction, sexual fulfillment, and individual happiness, intellectual honesty often overcomes ideological resistance. The early church father John Climacus wrote about the ladder of divine ascent, the idea that living according to wisdom creates an upward spiral of growth and fulfillment that becomes self reinforcing. I see this in couples who've chosen friendship, character, and commitment over casual dating. They report levels of intimacy and joy that make their lifestyle attractive to others. They become living advertisements for a better way. For someone feeling isolated in this commitment, remember that countercultural living always requires community. The early Christians understood this perfectly. They created alternative social structures that supported different ways of living. You need to actively seek friendships, mentorship, and communities that share these values, even if they're small or hard to find. But here's what's hopeful. This vision offers something that both men and women desperately want, but contemporary culture can't provide. It offers men a way to be strong without being toxic, and a way for women to be honored without rejecting femininity. It offers both sexes relief from the exhausting gender wars and access to the complementarity that creates lasting fascination and mutual delight. The cultural moment we're living through reminds me of what C.S. Lewis called the abolition of man, the elimination of permanent human nature in favor of endless reconstruction of identity and relationship. But human nature persists despite ideological attempts to suppress it. Young people are rediscovering that they have hearts designed for permanent love, bodies designed for committed intimacy, and souls designed for relationships that reflect divine love. What gives me ultimate hope is that authentic love also always wins in the end because it's aligned with reality in ways that counterfeits never can be. The early Christians didn't triumph through political power or cultural dominance, but through the simple attractiveness of lives lived in harmony with human nature. Their marriages were happier, their families more stable, their communities more fulfilling than the alternatives. Scripture promises that those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint. This applies directly to relationships. When we align our love lives with divine design, we tap into resources that sustain us through difficulties and create joy that deepens over time. Hope comes from recognizing that we're not trying to impose artificial restrictions on human nature, but rather rediscovering the conditions under which human beings naturally flourish in relationships. In conclusion, these are conditions that work just as well today as they did 2,000 years ago, because human nature itself hasn't changed despite cultural confusion about what that nature requires for genuine happiness.
Very well said, Mr. Mike. Very well said indeed. Yes, people dating in the new Rome ancient wisdom for swiping right world draws a striking parallel between the lavish, fast paced culture of ancient Rome and the modern world of instant connections and feeling digital romance. So, Mr. Mike, would you like to plug in something?
Thanks for the opportunity. Write the book, grow the business. Connect with me on LinkedIn, GMIC, the Doctor of Digital Smith, PhD. Also, listen to the Doctor of Digital podcast and also a couple books on Amazon that you can pick up. That is Burning America and On Track Ian Hunter.
Yes, people, let's support Mr. Meg, the podcast itself, and for sure the books. And please do listen to our baby podcast, Mental Health 101, because created Mental Health 101 is created to empower our mental health awareness. So, Mr. Meg, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, my friend. Until next time, a day is full.
Monticon people, see you soon.